Today, I am joined by Dr. Rosemary Hancock, who is a senior lecturer and assistant director of the Institute for Ethics and Society and convener of the Religion, Culture and Society Research Focus Area at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. She is a sociologist of religion who researches the engagement of religious actors in grassroots politics with a strong strong expertise in environmental politics. She's a world-leading expert on Islamic environmentalism, and her research grapples with the myriad of ways in which religion motivates and structures political action, the relationship between religious and political practice, and how the engagement of religious people and organizations in grassroots politics transforms both these spaces. And she's also published a book on Islam and environmentalism, which we'll touch on in this podcast as well. So again, thank you for coming on. And let's just begin with the initial question of, tell us about how your background, how you got interested in your research area of the intersection of politics and religion.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Hamza. It's lovely to meet you. I became interested in religion, politics, activism. I think it's funny. I think lots of sociologists of religion, there's a bit of a cliche that we all have our own sort of unique religious backstory, and I definitely do. My father is an Anglican priest, but as I discovered as I grew up and became exposed to sort of more outside the narrow little world that I existed in. He's quite an unusual Anglican priest. He's a Christian socialist, or at least comes from a long line of Christian socialists. And so the sort of version of Christianity that I grew up with was a little bit unorthodox, or at least a little bit different to what you might find in just your normal Anglican church if you walked in off the street. And there was a real emphasis on engagement with the world, and that what really mattered to God was what you did in the world, rather than necessarily some of the more ritual aspects, or like ritual aspects of religion, let's say. And growing up in that, so I think growing up in that environment really shaped a lot of my attitudes towards religion and my understanding of religious practice, and then coming to appreciate that that was actually not really how a lot of people experience or get taught about what religion might mean, or particularly Christianity in my case, made me really interested as I got older in finding out other places, other contexts where people were taking their religious beliefs and their practices and sort of living it out in the world. So yeah, I'm a sociologist of religion, and so I sort of study the dynamics of religion in contemporary society, but I'm less interested in sort of the formal ritual practices of religion and like institutions, religious institutions, than I am normal people out in the world doing things out in the world that might not necessarily be explicitly religious, but seeing how that might be motivated or influenced by religion and how it relates to their religious beliefs and practices.
Okay, interesting. And where does the confluence of politics and religion come into that?
So I think that politics is one of the places where people have the opportunity to try and either live out the moral kind of values that they hold, or to sort of advocate for the things that are really deeply important to them in society. So, you know, politics is where we make decisions about how we live together, and religions have a lot to say about how we ought to live together. You know, different religions have different ideas about, you know, how we ought to be living together, and how we ought to be structuring society. But politics is where we actually make the decisions in contemporary society about those things. And so getting involved in politics is often a way that religious people can sort of advocate for the things that are very important to them. I mean, I'd say that's for religious and non-religious people. But there seems to be, I think I'm curious about the way that religion influences how people get involved in politics. And there has been this, you know, there's been quite a long history, certainly within sort of Western political thought, that religion shouldn't be in politics, that sort of classic liberal understanding that religion doesn't belong in politics and should be walled out. But that is, I mean, there's also long critiques of that position, of which I'm I sort of would join some of those critiques, definitely, because I don't think that it's possible if you are a Muslim or if you are a Christian or if you're a Buddhist, if you enter into political life, you don't just forget that. It's not possible. Like, that's not an accurate representation of how people live their lives, right? You can't just walk into a voting booth, or if you're walk into sort of a grassroots organization to one of the meetings, or walk into parliament if you're a politician, and switch off half of your brain or half of your consciousness or something like that. Those things stay with you. So I think it's at the most basic, putting aside sort of questions of should ought religion be in or not, it be in politics or not. It's simply not possible for religion not to be in politics. If we have religious people involved in politics, religion is in politics.
Exactly. I've got some questions on that a bit later, but let's start with, you've published a book on Islamic environmentalism in the UK and the US. Yeah, what motivated you to study Islam coming from a Christian background, and what were your findings?
Yeah, I mean, so I was really interested. I think, like I said, I was very interested sort of in religion more broadly, coming out of my sort of Christian upbringing. I mean, to be honest, I think I was probably, so in their late teens, early 20s when I was doing my undergraduate, who, when you grow up within a particular culture or system, you sort of want to, I'm not sure if rebel is the right word, but you want to get out, right? You don't necessarily studying Christianity was boring because I grew up with Christianity. I knew about it. I wanted to learn new things. So I was really interested in not Christian religions. And I was doing lots of, reading. I am a total geek. So in my undergraduate, I was doing all my classes, but then also going to the library and getting out all of these religious studies books on various different religions. And I just became really, I'm not sure if I could pinpoint exactly what it was about Islam that I was most interested in. Possibly I'm just a product of my time, in terms of that sort of early to mid 2000s period where Islam was in the news all the time and constantly being debated publicly, in the context of various
Like 9/11.
terrorist attacks and things. Yeah, but I felt like, I think that I had this strong sense, and I'm not sure where it came from, but that was sort of, an unfair and unhelpful narrative. So I really just wanted to learn about it myself. So I went at the university that I was at, I was in New Zealand, so the University of Auckland, there really wasn't much opportunity to study Islam. In many courses, there was also no religious studies program either. So I moved to Sydney to do a master's in Islamic studies after I finished my undergraduate. And I was writing a thesis on Muslim women bloggers. This was, 2009. Blogging was still a big thing back then, not so much now, but it was then. And one of the bloggers was an environmentalist, and on her blog there were links to all of these. Oh gosh, you're asking. This was a long time ago now. I would probably have to go back to my thesis and check. But I do just recall that there was all of these links to Muslim environmental groups on her, or at least a couple on her page, and she was talking about Muslim and environmentalism from an Islamic perspective. It wasn't the exclusive focus of her blog, but this was in there. And I had been an environmentalist, am still really, and so I was really fascinated by this, and I started looking around and realized that there just really wasn't much, certainly sort of in sort of academic, English language academic kind of research about Muslim environmentalism, Islamic environmentalism, particularly the activism side of things. And that was, I knew I wanted to do a doctorate, and when you discover something like that, you go, oh wow, this is something I'm really interested in. It looks like there's not very much research on it. This seems like a really good topic for me to do my thesis on. So that's how I got started, at least. And then you wanted to know some of the findings as well.
Yeah, because you did some research in the UK and the US, right? So
US.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it was really interesting. I actually, so I started off intending it. I didn't intend it necessarily to be so narrowly focused on the US and the UK, and I did go to Jordan, in fact, for 9 months during my doctorate as well to do research. And what was interesting is that what I found in Jordan was that a lot of the environmentalism that I came across, and I want to put that caveat in there because I do want to say that, you know, as like a young academic, you know, a PhD student, you're sort of honing your skills, and sometimes my findings in Jordan may reflect my sort of naivety as a researcher rather than necessarily accurately what was there. But what I found in Jordan was that almost all the environmental stuff that I was able to access and find was sort of Western NGOs coming over, and they were trying to use Islamic discourse, but in a very instrumental way, and there weren't really that many Muslims involved. They were often being run by sort of, you know, young 20-year-old expats and that kind of thing. And when I'd get in contact with them and I'd come and I'd say I'm doing my doctorate on Islamic environmentalism, and they were all really excited and like, oh, we need you to tell us about how we can get Muslims involved in the work that we're doing. And I sort of went, wait, hang on, I'm trying to work out that same sort of question, right? I don't know the answer yet. That's the point of the study. Anyway, so what I found, and I sort of have a hypothesis for this in my book, but I want to stress that this is a hypothesis. What I found was that sort of explicitly Islamic environmentalism was more, if not more common, then at least much more visible in the diaspora. So particularly in the US and the UK, there seemed to be a lot going on. So that's kind of where I went, mostly out of convenience. That's where the most activity seemed to be happening. And my hypothesis for why that was the case in the book is that for people living in Muslim majority countries, I think there's an assumption that the life and the culture around you is Muslim and Islamic. You know, your religious practice is perhaps not something that you have to, or the sense in which you have to think about whether all of your practices are Muslim or not is maybe less because you're in a Muslim majority context. Whereas for people living in the US and the UK, there's a much more there seems to be a much more conscious engagement with, every time I'm joining a new activity, I have to think about how does this fit with my religious practice, with my beliefs. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like there's a more kind of conscious thinking about what does it mean to be a Muslim, and in this context, what does it mean to be a Muslim in that context, because people are living in a minority and it's a non-Muslim context. And so people getting involved in environmentalism were thinking, what does it mean to be a Muslim in this context? And so then thinking much more explicitly about what Islam might teach about the environment. So that was sort of one of the hypotheses I had about why it was more visible and more seemed to be, you know, more prevalent in the United States and the United Kingdom. Certainly, this was back in, I did most of my field work in 2012, 2013. But I mean, there was a variety of sort of other findings, I guess. Some of the things, so I was looking at why people get involved and stay involved in groups, in environmental groups. And interestingly, I think my findings were that, you know, in a sense, the sort of religious nature of these groups, the Islamic nature of these groups, didn't really have a big influence on that so much. And my findings were pretty consistent with other studies into environmental groups and activist groups more generally, which is that it's things like having friends or family members, people you like involved in the group, so you want to go, you want to participate because it's a nice, it allows you to connect with people and spend time with people that you want. So you have, it's called affective ties, strong affective ties to people. Sometimes it's charismatic leaders. So there are a couple of groups where I would have said the leader played a real influence. People became very attached to the leader and really wanted to be part of what they were doing, and so that, you know, those leaders were able to draw people in. There's always a question mark over groups like that, over what happens when that leader leaves. I'm trying to think what were some of the other things. So I mean, that was really key. And then another big factor is the extent to which people are also able to be involved in shaping the group themselves. And so groups that do, and again, this has got very little to do with the religious side of things, and this is pretty consistent across most activist groups. In the context of the sort of Muslim environmental groups that I was spending time with, groups that did things like sitting down and reading the Quran together and having an open discussion about how might we interpret these verses environmentally, or what might this mean for us in our environmental practice. There were some groups that did those sorts of activities, and people were very committed. They might be smaller groups in terms of numbers, but they had greater longevity, and people didn't drop out. They didn't have as much turnover because people were really invested. They felt like they were having a say in how the group was even thinking about environmentalism, and sort of shaping the ethos of the group and shaping the aims and intentions of the group and what they were trying to do in the world. And so groups that did that, rather than sort of saying, well, we already know what Islam teaches here, we're going to teach you what we say Islam teaches about the environment, and then you're going to come up. So groups that are, I guess, a little bit more sort of top-down directive tend to have a higher turnover of participants. So I guess a finding was that actually what is motivating people to participate in these groups, in Muslim environmental groups, and what's helping them sort of stick around and the groups to thrive, is actually quite similar to how other activist groups or other sort of grassroots political community groups work. Yeah, I'll leave that there. I mean, there's more to say about Islam, but it might be something that we can sort of follow up in other questions.
Okay, that's interesting. Just bringing it back to the point about the difference in the Jordan, or you could say Muslim majority countries versus the US and the UK, the diaspora there. Because there's a host of issues, isn't it? That in those countries they've been decimated by colonialism, they're economically weak, so their focus is economic growth, and the model that's taught to them is neoliberalism and opening up your market. So focus on that, industrialize, right? So they're not really focused on the environment. Maybe 20 years ago they weren't so focused on the environment. In the UK, US, much more educated population. Actually, well, in the UK we say, when we compare to the US, we say the US is like 20 years ahead of the UK because the nature of the Muslims who are there. So in the UK, 70% of Muslims are from the Pakistani background, and the majority of them came from the villages, which are quite rural. So they're not very educated.
Yeah.
They worked in factories. Whereas the US, they saw much more middle class migration from Pakistan and those countries. So in that sense, so even when it comes to activism, they're a lot more involved and a lot more active. We are catching up. And in the last 20 years, we're seeing a much more intense interest in environmental activism, Islamically anyway. Maybe that's just the younger population. They've got different mindset to the older generation. They're aware of the issues a lot more, and it has an emotional impact as well.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. What are the differences you noticed between the UK and the US when you did your research?
I think that there were. So I think that there were actually probably more similarities than differences. I think that there is definitely different political cultures across the two, and you're right that the US. I want to say that there's different political cultures, not so much that the US is more has a culture of greater political, like grassroots political involvement, because I'm not sure if that's I'm not sure if I would completely agree with that, but I think it's different. I think that the way that political life has worked in the US, and also the extent to which Christianity still plays a much greater public role in US political life, I think creates a slightly different type of environment for Muslims and Christians and sort of people of other religious groups to get involved in political life. Like there's been a long history of political organizing in religious communities in the United States, through like the Industrial Areas Foundation, which started in the 1930s. And I think that, I mean, those are predominantly focused on Christian, Jewish to an extent, but mostly Christian groups. But it has made the US much more open, I think, to religious participation in grassroots politics in a way that's a little bit different in the United Kingdom. And so I think that is sort of the background against which. So I think there is a background difference in political culture, but actually the sort of challenges that people were facing in the Muslim environmental groups, and the way that the groups were operating were relatively similar. And actually, so I'd say that there were across both the US and the UK in 2012, 2013, when I was doing this field work, all of the people I spoke to, all of the groups I spoke to, were really having a hard time motivating the communities that they were working with to get interested in environmentalism. We're really frustrated. They were sort of, it felt like a very marginal concern to them in their communities. So people felt like there were other things that were more important. And you sort of, to an extent, I think you touched on maybe a little bit of this when you were talking about the differences between the Muslim community in the UK and the US. In the UK, there were quite a few people I spoke to who were saying that sort of issues around over policing of the communities and sort of community disadvantage, and so working on poverty and that sort of thing were more important and had more sort of significance, and that with limited resources you have to do what's most needed, I guess. So I did find that, and I think that was a struggle that, but it was also a struggle that people had in the US as well. So some of the participants from a really big, there was a sort of a Green Muslims group that was associated with one of the largest mosques in California, and they were talking about how, they sort of worked with the mosque to set up recycling programs and run workshops on waste and recycling, and people didn't come to the workshops and were just ignoring the signs about how to sort the rubbish and putting things in all the wrong places and just not making an effort, not making an effort at all. And they felt like they were really banging their head against a brick wall and trying to get change happening just within the confines of the mosque. And there was an activist in the UK who was talking about environmentalism at her mosque, and sort of another woman in the mosque sort of said, well, what's that got to do with you? Like, why are you worried about that? This is not a Muslim issue. It's not an Islamic issue. And so I think there was, across both the US and the UK, the activists were having it was very marginal, and they had a hard time getting the message out. There were some people that there were some wonderful stories of people that they were able to reach, and they had their own wonderful stories about how they kind of came to environmentalism themselves, which I think motivated them to keep going. They knew that they had sort of been transformed in this process. But yeah, I think so. I think there are sort of more similarities than differences actually between the two contexts. Certainly when I was doing my research.
I know you're a sociologist, so the way you're coming out is very, very sociological. But how much delve into any of the theology or philosophy of Islam when you're researching into it?
Yeah, so for my thesis, I wrote there is, I think in the thesis itself, it's a whole chapter. I think in the book it turns into less, because you have to change these things for when you turn it into a book. I think in the thesis itself, it was a whole chapter that was an analysis of there was an analysis of the kind of theology of environmentalism within Islam. So looking at how Muslim authors had been writing about environmentalism, what kind of sources they were going to in the Quran and the Hadith, going and doing my own sort of analysis of that. So I did spend a little bit of time doing that, and did, you know, read the Quran cover to cover and sort of do my own analysis of environmental verses in the Quran and that kind of thing.
Oh,
Yeah.
right. How was that reading it cover to cover? Because I know it can be quite tricky sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it was
Not like a normal book. Yeah.
no, it's not a normal
Right.
book. Yeah, it was, I mean, it was, I think it was great. I should, you know, I mean, I was reading it for a purpose. I should, you know, like I was specifically looking for where are there things that could be relevant to environmentalism? Where are the things that I know people are mentioning all the time, right? What are the verses people are mentioning, but what else is there that maybe people aren't saying or aren't mentioning? There's some really, you know, there were some really interesting findings there. So one of the things, I'm sure I'm not the first person to point this out, and it would have been pointed out in lots of other contexts, is that there are kind of multiple creation stories in the Quran, and that at no point is this idea. So a lot of the critique against Christianity in the context of environmentalism comes from Genesis 1, where God tells people to subdue the earth, and gives humans sort of dominion over the earth. And what's really interesting is that sort of the equivalent word in Arabic for dominion in the Quran is only ever used when it's talking about the earth or who has dominion over the earth. It's only ever God who has dominion over the earth. That sort of word is sometimes used in the context of a king having dominion over a specific kingdom, but it's never, if we're talking about sort of the earth as a whole, it's only ever God in the Quran. And that was a really interesting difference that I found, certainly between sort of like Christian and Islamic teaching on the environment. Yeah.
Given that you're coming from a Christian background, there's a lot of verses in the Quran which actually speak to Christians. How did you find those?
I mean, that wasn't, so when I read, it wasn't a surprise to me because I had done my master's in Islamic studies, and had done a variety of, I was familiar, I hadn't read the Quran cover to cover, but I was familiar with a lot of the general content of what would be in there. So I knew that you know, Mary was going to appear more times in the Quran than she does in the Bible, for example, and that there was going to be a lot of familiarity, similar prophets. Jesus was going to be in there. I knew what to expect. I think it was more the close reading that I needed to do.
Yeah, and just bringing it back to the environmentalism point, I think you mentioned the challenges that different groups in the UK and the US mentioned about it not being a priority and things like that. Remember, someone actually told me, like one of the activists who's a bit older now, he said about back in like the 90s and early 2000s, he had issues as well, in getting the message across that there's an environmental message in Islam, primarily because it was seen as a Western issue. I think one of the reasons for that was because in earlier generations, like the first generation or second generation migrants to the UK who were Muslim, they had this like idea of like anything Western is un-Islamic because of the whole colonial kind of trauma. So like even music was like seen as not un-Islamic. Any kind of Western music, wearing Western clothes like suits and stuff frowned upon. So and any kind of political engagement as well as like anything was seen as sinful. So they're just stuck in these communities and they didn't engage. But nowadays, there's I think it's just widely accepted now by everyone. Environmental crisis affecting everyone, especially as we're seeing the adverse effects of it in real time now. I think 30 years ago, people didn't really see the effects that much, but now you can go to any country and they can give you more than 10 reasons how climate change has affected them or environmental degradation.
Yeah. I mean, I think something that's really interesting to talk about here, and this is something that I think about a little bit now. It doesn't really come up in my book on Islamic environmentalism, You can find it. You can find a better discussion of it in Anna Gade's book on Muslim. It's called Muslim Environmentalism, and that's that. So there's the science of kind of climate change and environmentalism, which and sort of sorry, the science of climate change and sort of the environmental crises, the changes that are happening in our environment. But then there's also a lot of the discourse on environmentalism, a lot of the way that we talk about what the environment is, how we should behave around it, what, you know, kind of the ethics of being environmentally responsible. A lot of that comes from a really Western genealogy of thought that kind of you know, the environmental movement starts in the UK, and it was an elite movement of landowners who didn't want the railways to be expanded into remote areas of the UK, because then the common people would be able to access it, and maybe they weren't fully it would be overrun with all these people that weren't properly educated enough to fully appreciate the wonders of nature. And so the preservation movement has this really kind of elitist, I mean, that's the early origins of environmentalism. But as it grows and it changes, you know, as it does. But a lot of the big thinkers that really shape how we think about what nature is, what humans are, and our relationship to nature in the environmental movement, in environmental discourse, are these Western thinkers. And so there is an extent to which I think it's relevant to think critically about different ways of understanding the relationship that humans might have to nature, and how that arises sort of indigenously within different cultures. And so the Anna Gade's book that I spoke about does a wonderful job of talking about how a different type of concept of the environment and ethics of environmentalism arise in Indonesian Islam, in particular contexts. And it is, I think it is worth saying that even though environmental crises are experienced globally, climate change is experienced globally, you know, physics doesn't change from from one country to another. How we understand and think about our relationship to the environment, though, might be different, and the ideas about how we go about doing environmentalism, the ethics of environmentalism that's coming out of the West, might not always be the most appropriate in every context. And so it is absolutely, I think, not only worth, but critical to try and have a broader understanding of environmentalism and engage with different ideas and thinking about environmentalism in different contexts. Otherwise, you do end up with a type of almost like an intellectual colonialism, where you're importing these ideas that originated elsewhere to contexts where they might not be the most salient.
Yeah. I want to add in the politics now. So you touched on earlier the idea of like religious people, can we really discard our religion when it comes to politics? So what in the modern secular democratic age, right? You're in Australia, I'm in Britain. They're fairly similar. I think they're parliamentary democracies. They're both secular. Like, at least if there is Christianity, I know England has like bishops and stuff, but it's the laws are all secular. There's no like actual Christianity anymore, which has an influence in the laws. How do people of like, but still, I know there's a recent poll in census in the UK which said that the majority population are now atheists or agnostic. So, but still about 40% of people in the UK have a conception of divinity or some kind of divine being. But those people don't just discard their beliefs, you know, like I'll speak as a Muslim here, you know, I don't it's not like something you can compartmentalize and put in a corner and just leave at home, right? It's just the way you live life is by doing God, right? That's just how it is. There's no demarcation now. Okay, this is religion. That's not, like, even eating food, right? I thank God before I have the food. It's just, I can't, like, I can't secularize it, right? It's just, it's a way of operating. So how do people who have faith, how do we engage in a democratic secular world in politics, and what does that look like?
I mean, wow, how much time do we have? This is a massive question. I've actually done, so a lot of my postdoctoral research has been exactly on these sorts of questions. So after writing my PhD, I did a study of a community organization in Sydney that gets involved in sort of grassroots social justice work in Sydney, but they are made up of a diverse range of religious and non-religious. So you have sort of Christian, Muslim, Jewish, some sort of Sikh groups involved, but you also have trade unions and environmental groups. And so you have people from lots of different contexts coming together to do politics together in this group. It was a really interesting study. So I think about this kind of thing quite a bit. And there's a few things to say. I mean, the first is that there is no easy answer to that question. I want to preface that preface this conversation with that. But the fact of pluralism is kind of one of the big problems, right? We live in a plural society, and we have to, whether you are a Muslim, whether you are Christian, whether you are an atheist, whether you, I don't know, are agnostic, but I don't know, do tarot cards on the weekends, whatever it might be, you know, people have a huge diversity of kind of beliefs, and we all have to figure out how we're going to live together and do politics together. And I would say that I don't want to get into sort of like oughts or shoulds, because I'm really a sociologist rather than a philosopher, right? But I think that it's important to recognize that people do have very diverse viewpoints. So this is what I was saying before, that we can't set aside our sort of religious beliefs, but also, you know, there are people for whom it's not fair to ask them to set aside, I don't know, their Marxist beliefs, or, you know, whatever it might be. We come into our political lives and into our political actions with pre-existing values, and everyone does that, whether they're religious or not. And so any kind of political system that we have needs to be able to honestly account for that. So I don't think the problems that I have with this idea of keeping religion out of politics is not only that it is not a reflection of reality, but that it also, I think, promotes dishonesty, in the sense that if you have people who are not talking about where their values are coming from, or where their ideas are coming from, or the things that are motivating them to advocate for particular political positions, that's a kind of you know, we're hiding what's really motivating people's political decision making. So I think there's a degree of honesty in political decision making that's helpful. That organization that I studied actually would argue, and that whole kind of political organizing concept of getting people together across diverse religious and non-religious backgrounds, it's called kind of community organizing. I know you have it in the UK in is it Citizens UK? Is the group. They do that. It's a similar type of group that I was researching with. They would argue that there's power in their sort of model, which I'm not saying is perfect, but is an interesting model. Argues that there's sort of power, in fact, in this diversity, and that you can get people to find common ground. So if you can have people working together on issues that they might agree on, and trying to build relationships across difference, and so putting relationships ahead of issues, and building trust between different communities, you can start being able to work together in a way that's really honest about who you are. And so in those organizations, everyone stands up and says, you know, if there's a big sort of community meeting, there'll be a roll call. Literally, we kind of like in school, but instead of individual names, it will be the organization. So in the group that I was doing research with, it would be, you know, you might have like, I don't know, the St. Vincent de Paul Society, and everyone there from the St. Vincent de Paul Society stands up. And then you say the Jewish Board of Deputies, and everyone from the Jewish Board of Deputies stands up. And so you have a really visible accounting for religion in this kind of model, where it's very honest about who is in the room. And I think that is important. And I think it's also helpful for some people. And there's lovely stories that have come out of that research of people who, for example, their religious practice and identity has always been very private to them, particularly some of the people that were involved in some of the trade unions, which, you know, is a very secular space. And there's some wonderful stories of, some people who are very committed Christians in trade unions, quite, and quite senior within trade unions. And in the Sydney Alliance, which is the name of that group, it was really the first time that they were able to be really honest about their Christianity, because they would get to, at these meetings, they would call out, whatever trade union it was, and these people would stand up. But then when they called out, the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney, they would also get to stand up as well, because they were part of the Catholic Diocese of Sydney. So there was a sense in which there was a recognition of multiple selves in public life. And so I think that, and then I think that is better than saying religion is not in political life at all. I don't know that necessarily answers your question about how I'm not sure if we can even answer the question of how we do it like well or perfectly or without conflict, because I don't think it's possible. I think there is always going to be, in a plural society, there is always going to be conflict. People are always going to disagree with one another. And I mean, just this is not necessarily my academic response, but my personal response is, I never want to be told what to think. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think I should tell other people what they should think either. And I think that sort of, if that's the case, then we need to figure out if that's sort of the minimum bar. I guess we can't tell other people what to think. We have to be willing to not just tolerate, but actually accept as a normal part of political life that people are going to have different opinions to us. Then we can start figuring out how do we deal with the conflict that will inevitably arise in a way that's not really destructive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just I know you said you're not very, like, you're a sociologist, don't be too philosophical, but we got to do it sometimes. Going back,
of course.
Think about the history of secularism. It emerges from a Europe which has been fighting with itself, a Christian Europe of different denominations, fighting each other endlessly, and in a bid to end war, they discard religion to the side so they can just live in peace and harmony. But Europe has also had a history of the creed being set by the Pope or the King. So there's been like a monolithic law always in Europe. The King sets it, or the Pope has set it. So when it comes to, and also the idea of nationalism, it really is like it's this notion of like the people of a certain area or geography, they have a similar kind of ethos, they speak the same language, they have a shared culture, they look the same, that kind of thing. And maybe that holds itself for a while, because when you impose one kind of law system on them, it's okay because they're all kind of similar. But when you start becoming multicultural, significantly, that can lead to issues, because this group of people want to live by this particular customs and those people have those customs, but then you have the law trying to enforce the same thing on everyone and everyone's different. For instance, I'll give you an example. When it comes to marriage, so as a Muslim, me and my wife, we have the Islamic nikah contract, right? Which that's a religious marriage, and if we have that, we signed that. For all intents and purposes, under God's eyes, we're married. So, despite our legal contract in the UK, we did because it was COVID as well. Around the time we got married, that was done like 9 to 12 months ish after we actually did a nikah contract. But we considered ourselves married into like a year before that legal UK law contract was done. But then the marriage is probably like not a big issue, massive, but there are other issues which come in. People of different communities have different customs, and then sometimes they can really infract on. Actually, as a better one is actually finance, which is, for instance, taking loans. A big issue in the UK with Muslims is they consider usury as forbidden, so that reduces access to finance, and because the financial system is fairly monolithic, most of those loans are usury-based loans, and so there are new products being created now in Islamic finance to cater for those for that demographic. But this is an example of, I think, in politics, imposing one law on all in a very strict way may lead to tension. And I think the idea of keep your religion at home, just do what must be done, that can actually marginalize people and actually lead to political apathy, because you think these people don't care about you. So you're just going to have a very base social contract, like you pay your taxes, you pay the law, and that's it. Then you don't engage.
I mean, again, this is such a huge kind of issue. In fact, I was at a conference in early December on religious constitutionalism, which was debating a lot of these things. I should say that it's, I was sort of a very much an onlooker at that conference. Was sort of law and religion is fairly well outside my expertise, but it's really interesting, and I think that there is it's a very live debate about how law in the context of pluralism and how and where you want to allow kind of people to be able to, what am I trying to say? I think how far law can reach, and like where the boundaries of law are, as in state law are, and where state coercion is proper, let's say, and where you should just leave people to be able to do their own thing. And yeah, and sort of there are minimalist ideas where you only have a very minimalist kind of state law, and then and people are very free outside of that, and that allows a lot of room for pluralist. But there are always going to be there's almost always, and this is the issue. So in Australia, we've had a few decades of debate over religious freedom laws. And a colleague of mine has done some Eleni Poulos has done really interesting research into religious freedom laws in Australia, and some of the discourses around religious freedom and how that's conceptualized, and how that conceptualization of what religious freedom means has changed over time. Because some understandings of religious freedom are you have diverse groups that should be free to practice their religion and free from discrimination, and it's really thinking about in the context of migrant communities that might experience discrimination, let's say, and there should be freedoms for them to practice their religion as much as possible within the bounds of the law, and that you might call that so there's that type of freedom. But then there's also the types of freedom which is more common now, my colleague has sort of found, which is actually freedom of religious groups to discriminate. So not freedom of religious groups to be free themselves from discrimination and just sort of get on with their lives, but actually the freedom to discriminate against others. So the freedom to exclude people from schools, or I don't know, either not upholding some of their religious beliefs or values, the freedom to fire teachers for getting a divorce, let's say, in a conservative kind of Christian school, the freedom to deny service to people if you run. I mean, there are the classic cases in the United States of conservative Christians who refuse to make cakes for LGBT couples, let's say. And so they're actually two different ideas of freedom at play. And how you create law. I mean, I'm simply pointing this out. I'm not coming down either way here, but there is sort of freedom from discrimination and then freedom to discriminate, and religious freedom is sort of thought about in both of those ways, and how that would manifest in law is two actually very different legal systems. So it's a very interesting area to talk about.
I think that's a very well articulated way of putting it: the freedom to discriminate and the freedom from discrimination. Yeah, that's a very succinct way of putting it. So if, let's say, actually, what do you think is the most optimal for like to have a healthy democracy? What do you think is best? Do you have both? To have one, or to have one? Just.
I mean, so my position would be that you want freedom from discrimination is important, which means all rights are everyone has some curtailment on their freedom. Like, it's not possible for me to decide not to teach someone in my classes because I don't like what they believe or I don't like their religion or what have you. Like, I am obligated to treat everyone equally, and I can practice my religious beliefs freely as long as they're not impinging on anyone else's freedom. That would be my kind of, so this is that freedom from discrimination. As long as I'm not discriminating against anyone else and not breaking some, you know, important basic laws, then I have the freedom to practice my religion. But I'm not, so I definitely would advocate for freedom from discrimination, not freedom to discriminate.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And given your focus on ethics, I know you focus on that quite a bit. How do you think that religion, well, the intersection of religion with politics and activism manifests globally? Because I know, like, locally, there's issues of like, you know, as you mentioned, the LGBT cutting the cake, and there's numerous other ones as well. How do you think globally religion and politics will intersect, and activism as well?
Oh, I mean, there's lots of different ways to answer that question. I think that, so I think there's a couple of things that happen. I think that there has been sort of like a globalization of certain types of politics, in the sense that some, in the same way that, say, environmentalism has globalized, right? You have major environmental NGOs working across multiple different countries. There are really similar, consistent themes, let's say, that come up in environmental activism. You also have certain types of religious politics that have globalized as well. The most obvious example, certainly in the Western context, is sort of certain very kind of conservative right-wing political Christian groups, and that was that started in sort of the 70s and 80s in the United States, but certainly in Australia, I know that there's really strong connections between certain elements of kind of Christian right-wing politics and some of the right-wing politics that happen in Australia, that this seems to be kind of like a trend that is happening, and that influence is going elsewhere. There are examples of sort of transnational Muslim political, Islamic political groups as well. So there's lots of, I think we live in a world that is so interconnected with technology and travel. It's not possible to put the genie back in the box. You know, like, if ideas are popular, they're going to be global and they're going to spread. So I think there's an extent to which sort of global religious movements, let's say, are inevitable and are going to continue. One of the things that's interesting me most at the moment is the conversations about sort of global eco-constitutionalism, global kind of how we might deal, the idea that the climate crisis is not something that we can deal with on like nation by nation, because it doesn't respect national borders, right? It's a global problem and it needs some kind of global legal framework. And there's some kind of political thinkers who are thinking about this, and legal thinkers that are thinking about this. And but as we spoke about earlier, I think that there's a really particular Western and Christian intellectual genealogy to how we're thinking, to how we both law itself, but also how we think about environmentalism and what that means, what the relationships between humans and nature is. And that's influencing this discourse on global eco-constitutionalism. And I would really like to see more engagement and understanding of diverse kind of religious ideas, diverse religious sources of law, like Islam, so that any sort of future, these sort of discussions of sort of global legal norms around the environment is much more inclusive and palatable, let's say, to a wider range of people, and it's not just going to be this top-down enforcement of someone else's ideas.
Yeah, I think the environment is probably one of the issues where there's a lot of unity across various religions. I know the UN Environment Program. I know during the COP that they bring together all the different faith leaders from across the world for different religions,
Yeah.
and they publish their declarations and documents.
Yep.
Whether it gets ratified by different countries and leaders is a different issue.
Of course.
Yeah. There's actually one that's being worked on right now. I'm not sure if you heard of it, called the Mizan document, which is about getting all the Muslim environmental ministers to ratify a document which says that because they're Muslims, they have a legal obligation to take care of the environment as per their religion. So that's underway right now across the Muslim countries.
Because there was the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change. Is this kind of like 2.0, like another version of that? Because that was in 2015,
No,
2016.
that was more of like that was just more of like issuing a statement to say, look, this is the summary of, yeah. But this document is Mizan, is like is born from the UN, and it's about getting, because when the COP happens, you get all the ministers coming. It's about getting them all to sign this document, say, look, we're definitely gonna we have an obligation to care for the environment and to make to take action on it. But yeah, anyway, that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Plus, especially with most of the Muslim countries are in the developing world, and so there's an issue of environmental justice because they're not really polluting that much comparatively to China or the US, or European nations. Yeah. I know time is coming to a close now, so we'll finish off on that. I'll say thank you very much for coming on. I've really learned a lot. It's very interesting as well, hearing your views.
It was lovely to chat, Hamza. Thank you for inviting me.